Wish you were one of those influencers with raving fans who binge on your every word, consume all your content, buy everything you have to sell, and demand even more? Then stay tuned while Authority Magazine columnist and BuzzFeed contributor Tracy Hazzard shares strategies, tips, and tactics from top videocasters, podcasters, authors, and social influencers on creating that bingeable factor. Now, let's join Tracy as she explores how to rise above all the digital noise with the binge factor.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Binge Factor. I'm Tracy Hazzard, and I have Ginni Saraswati on the show today. And Ginni Media, PodPops, The Ginni Show. There's over, I think, 80 shows on their website that she's helped produce, launch into the market, and at least 50 of them are still in production right now. So they're actively posting, and some are off season. It's just, she's phenomenal in the types of shows, the variety of shows that she's helped produce. I'm just astounded that she and I haven't met yet. It's crazy that we haven't met yet. And so I'm so grateful that this show helps me do that. She has a career in broadcast radio already before she became a podcaster, and she's got such a distinct voice in podcasting. And it's not just the sound of her voice, because you're going to hear this Australia accent, but she comes from Sri Lanka before that. She is just a powerhouse in the podcasting industry, and PodPops is a really cool podcast. It's news media focused. So if you are interested in hearing the latest and greatest of what's going on in the podcast industry, you should be listening to PodPops. So let's talk to Ginni and get the scoop on how she's been able to create so many successes for herself and for her clients. Ginni, I'm so glad to have another pro. We started the same year in podcasting. Podcasting business. My podcast first started 2014, but 2017 we went into business. So
I love that we get to meet fellow OGs in podcasting, because 2014 that was only radio hosts or FM broadcasters primarily putting out podcasts.
Or tech geeks like me.
Exactly. So lovely to meet a fellow OG in podcasting. So thank you, Tracy, for having me.
Cannot believe our paths haven't crossed before now, because it should have happened, but that's a wonderful thing. At least it's finally happening, right?
Exactly. I'm glad to be here, and I'm really, really grateful to be speaking with you today.
Well, PodPops is a really different type of show than we typically talk about here. So I want to start with that one, because that's your newer show. Yes. You have a show that you've been running since 2017, which is in a remix. So we'll talk about that too. But PodPops is a news media style show, and you come out of that broadcast media background. So, how is that one going? Because typically we see that the news medias don't get binged upon as easily because they're too currently relevant. But how's it going for you?
This is the thing, what my team came to me with this idea, back in, I think it was 2021, we had coming off the pandemic, all the creative ideas were incubating as we were building our business. My team's like, we should do an Alexa flash briefing. I'm like, sure. And then they gave me the scope of work of what it would actually look like. It's so Ginni, you'd have to record something for 6 to 7 episodes. I'm like, hang on, what, 7 episodes, a month? They're like, no, a week. And I'm like, sure, let's do it. And then, when you say yes to something and then you do it, you're like, oh, this is crazy. But you just hold on to that roller coaster rail and you just go with it. So
I feel like that's how podcasting started for me. So I'm totally there with you.
So you feel me, Tracy. So this is what PodPops was like for me. With 7 episodes, we did content daily. I'm like, okay, this is doable. My team are fantastic. They help with the research and put things together so I can record the show. And then our producer goes in and mixes it up and puts it onto our media host. So that worked out really well. And then now what I'm finding is, some hesitations I get from my clients are we don't want to do a news podcast for the very reason you mentioned. It's well, it's old news. I'm like, yes, but you're still relevant on the day. And there's documented evidence or documented episodes to say you were speaking about it when it came out. So sometimes I think it's a crazy idea, and I still think it's crazy. However, I find what's really great about it is I love recording episodes. It keeps me informed about what's going on with the news. I get to kind of have my own take and reflection process on it, and I get to share it with my audience. So anybody looking for pod tips or pod news or what's happening in podcast advertising, I get to share that too. So it's kind of The perpetual student in me, Tracy, is very excited. The entrepreneur in me thinks this is a crazy idea. And just the inner child in me is like, I love doing this. So that's like a multifaceted answer there for you.
Well, I don't think we could be doing podcasting as long as we have if we didn't love it, like underneath that part. I love being behind the mic too. So I relate to that. But yeah, I do think there's like it's a different animal doing a show. The shorter shows are actually harder. And that's what I think people don't understand.
Yeah, because when I started radio, you mentioned my background in broadcast media. I was like doing daytime shows and that sort of thing. And, you know, the program director was like, it's very hard to sound excited for a longer period of time. I'm like, come on, I'm in my 20s. I can be excited all the time. But she was right. To be excited on air behind a microphone, to convey that emotion just using voice, it's a skill that you need to learn. And the shorter episodes, you kind of need to double down on that energy because you only have a smaller amount of time to make that impact, right? So you got to be extra excited, extra happy, extra quirky in a way. But it's also, to your point, the consistency, keeping it going every single day and keeping it going and well produced every single day. So it is, like I said, it's that roller coaster ride. You hold on to it and you're like, okay, this is going to be fun along the way.
Well, we start a brand new show every single year so we can see what it's like for our clients. And this year, our plan is I don't want to say it's a news media show because it's not about news at all, but it is more of a daily style show. And it's taken so much longer for us to get it going and planning because we plan to live stream it. So it has to be ready to go. Like you can't, you can't play with it behind the scenes. You got to jump right in and start it live. So it's taken us, I mean, look, we're almost halfway through the year and we haven't even launched it yet. And that's not like us. Usually within the first 2 months of the year, we got our new show launched. And this one's taking longer because it does. It takes more production. It takes more planning. It takes more setup to get it going and get your systems in place behind the scenes too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right too, because it does take a while to get into the groove. A lot of clients, and I'm sure you've been through this too, Tracy, in your experience, the hesitation and I guess the whole feeling of imposter syndrome about getting behind the mic, the worry about how do I sound? How do I look now with video podcasting? That in itself can be a lot for a client to rub up against. So you've got all of that. Then you've got teams like us that come in and do the post-production for it. But getting them actually to go behind the mic takes a lot more, I guess, pep talking than we probably used to.
That's right. Yeah, it's like you just got to sit back and do it. Just do it. Get going.
Exactly.
I know,
it's like,
because
you're
it's hard.
brilliant, you got this, but it takes a while. So I can hear that.
Yeah, it so does. But you know what? I think it's so interesting that you probably take the same approach because I can hear it in the shows. It's like you don't want to bother the host, especially in a business podcast world, with everything at once. So you got to layer it on. So you get started and then you add the next thing. And then you get started and you add the next thing. And that's more difficult in a live stream show. But in a podcast, it's actually a lot easier than doing video and other things. And I think people don't realize that you can take your time to really grow that up.
100%. I think it goes, that saying, you can't change a habit if you try to do too many things at once. Same thing applies to podcasting as well, because podcasting it's like a habit because you have to be consistent. You have to put out episodes when you tell your audience, hey, I've got an episode out. You want to, put out things consistently, remain trustworthy, build up all those things. But if you do too much at once, you also don't know how to track your growth, right? It's like, what was the variable or what was the point that actually led to this? So I hear you on that. It's one of those things that you can actually layer over time. And it's one of those mediums because it is, a medium where like you're behind a mic, you're talking to someone, it's a conversation. You can be like, oh yes, next time I'll be sure to do this. You're learning along the way. And I think that's so powerful about this medium as well, that the intimacy it creates in the content that we make and also how we can learn along the way of how we can take it up a notch each time.
Yeah. And I think it's the same thing for layering because you predominantly work with small to medium-sized businesses, entrepreneurs, and some corporations. And you have to layer the return on investment as well. Yeah. It takes time. It's a marathon, not a sprint in podcasting. So it takes time to get to the ultimate outcome and goal that they're looking for.
Exactly. It does take time. And I think setting that expectation to be like, this is going to be a marathon. It's not a sprint. You're not going to get to like, your top 10, unless there are ways that we've heard about that people do kind of sneak or cheat, let's just say, to get there. But yes, it is a marathon, but it's also the bigger vision, like businesses, right? Where does this podcast fit into your bigger vision of content? Where does it fit into lead gen? Where does it fit into how you represent yourself as a brand business person in the world? I think if you start looking at it from that angle, it's far more value driven and far more incentivized to actually do a podcast when you look at it from a bigger picture point of view.
Well, I have this conversation with them all the time. And I was like, how many people do you speak to each week?
Yeah.
How many stages are you on? And how many people are in front of you? And they're smaller and smaller groups every single day. And I was like, your podcast has 1,000 downloads this week. That's 1,000 people you were in front of that you weren't in front of last week.
Exactly.
The last event you did, you traveled to, you spent all this money. And so your podcast cost you.
Yeah. I think people are looking at when it comes to podcast numbers and listens, they hear like all the top podcasters, hey, I have 10 million downloads. I have this million, that million. But for a business context, right? I think we need to start looking at depth. To your point, 1,000 people that you got in front of with recording an episode, that one-time investment, 1,000 people that you got in front of, that your message was heard through. That is, the impact for that is far greater. And I think that's a metric that we need to start talking about.
And it's 1,000 people who chose you, which is so different than just being broadcast out, right? That's the difference between radio and podcasting.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think this is such a critical adjustment point in podcasting. And you mentioned this, there's a lot of cheating, a lot of fake information, which harms the whole industry, but it also harms, I think, the individual podcaster. You cannot sustain that level of downloads when you fake it at the beginning. It doesn't happen. You see a dip, it harms you more. And that it's not serving the industry or your business well.
Exactly. And I think that's the long-term game that you were talking about, Tracy. It is a long-term investment. But if you are a business, I'm going to put it in the business context too. If you think of how much you spend on a billboard, right? Like a billboard starts at $5,000. You can probably get, 40 podcasts produced for that cost. But you also know how many people listened. You know where they listened from, their location, you actually have data. You don't know how many people looked at the billboard. Like you can get an average from the advertiser that sold it to you, but just that tangible, my content is getting out there. People want to listen to it. People are finding it. I'm getting my name out there. And I think, when you cheat that system, you don't really have a clear direction as to where you're going to go to. So you actually do yourself a disservice when you do that.
Well, I want to talk about some of this pre-production side of things, because that's where you're really an expert in, and really you help companies determine their direction, what their show is going to be about, how they're going to record, and what topics they're going to cover, who they're going to interview. What advice do you give them, and what kind of skills do you need to be able to determine those things?
That's a great question, Tracy. So you've got a few things in there. Skills, what do I tell them? Like, how do I determine things? So there's a lot of planning that goes, a lot of pre-planning that goes into the show. I love just getting into the person's head. Like, what's the vision for the podcast? Why do you want to do it? And then you can get an idea if they want to do this to make money very quickly. You can do it if they just want to blow this up very quickly and sell advertisements for whatever reason. You can kind of get a gauge on their intent and their integrity. I said, for want of a better term, you can get a gauge of what's going on. And then from there, you kind of approach it like, I would call this my Shonda Rhimes moment. You'd look at it and be like, okay, how can I write a 12-episode arc for this? Like, what are some topics? Now, typically, if it's a business podcast and it's for the clientele that they serve, I'd ask, say it's a coaching business, I'd be like, okay, what are the 12 common questions your clients ask you? It could be like, how do I do this? How do I do that? That is the topic for the next 12 episodes, because there's plenty of FAQs that businesses get. You as a podcast host and as a producer, we get similar questions. So those are the questions that you would turn into an episode because you're so natural at doing it. So we've already taken the client and put them into their zone of genius. They're like, okay, I'm feeling comfortable about this.
Which makes them feel comfortable, right?
Exactly. Like,
that's good.
I can do this. And then they're like, okay, so how do I prep for this? So we go through, and I don't like to over prep my hosts, only because when I started out in radio, I scripted my whole show, and how I started to how I ended, you could hear the difference. But obviously that's what I needed at the time. So if some people need that, I get it. And typically when that happens, I can say I told you so in 2-3 episodes. They're like, oh, I can hear what you meant, Ginni. I'm like, it's cool. You need to do what you do. Like you said, layers, right?
Layers, right. Yeah. I'm so
there.
glad to hear that, because you do offer scripting. It's a part of your services. And
Yes.
and the thing is that I'm not a fan of scripted shows. I can see a significant statistical difference between scripted shows and non-scripted shows.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean you don't have some guidelines. You don't have like bullet points.
Yeah.
You don't have like real, flow planned out. But to actually script it out and read it word for word, very few people are skilled at doing that.
It's also, you miss out on like the conversation part of it, right?
Yeah.
Like you say something like they could drop gold, but you're so focused on the next question that you miss it. So again, it's funny, like what we do is I feel like, and I tell my team this, it's like we elevate diverse voices, we give them a platform to be seen and heard, but we also have to be those who see and who hear people. So when we're in conversation, I think what makes a good podcast host is one who actually listens, not waits for their turn to speak. I guess that's a Dalai Lama thing in life as well, but like it's the truth. I think when it's too scripted, that safety blanket, it's there, but it negates the whole conversational process. And I feel that's what makes a great podcast, the difference between a great podcast to a good podcast, right? That conversational element when they listen. So our pre-production services, so we'd plan that, we'd go through that, and like the host gets excited. They're like, okay, great. And then we set up their cover art for them. We launch their podcast for them. We do a trailer, show description, all of that. We look at their SEO with that little software that we use. And then from there, so now that they're feeling confident, they're prepared, they're like, okay, I can do this. We literally say, hey, we do everything else for you. You can come and record with us. We have a live technician that shows up. We have a studio in New York if people want to record locally. So they show up, they record, and then we go through our post-production mill. So it's the pre-production part, a lot has to do with alignment, confidence building, and just getting a gauge of where the host is at. Like doing a podcast for some people is like jumping into a deep water and they don't know if they can swim. But you just know that they're ready to jump. So that's how far that, as a producer, I can push them a little bit to do this instead of that. So
we might not go off the high board yet, but we're going to still go in deep water. Yeah,
exactly.
I love it. I love it. That's, I think that not enough time is spent for a lot of podcasters. They take one of these courses and they think, oh, this is just easy and I'll just dive into it. But they haven't actually put the thought in, and it's not as much the practice as it is the thought into
absolutely
what do I want to talk about, what are my outcomes, what are my goals for this, and by you guiding them through that process, it's going to be a much better show, which is why you have so many shows that are still around and doing so well. You are already defying the odds of pod fade on your network, just like we do on ours. So I know that is because strategy is aligned.
Absolutely. It's strategy. It's also getting the right guests, making sure that, again, using the word alignment, as wooey as that sounds, that is important, because if a podcast isn't part of the business strategy, if you feel like you could be doing something else, if blogs work for you, okay. These are the things that I feel that at that start phase, you can see where the person's at, because in 3 years' time, they could be doing a podcast, but like, actually, I want to do this now. This feels right for me. So to your point, like, there's accountability in that. There's kind of hand holding, but there's also another process of, does this actually feel right or best for the person or the business or the brand right now? Like, what does a brand need to be doing?
So I want to, because obviously this is the binge factor. So I want to talk a little bit about binging on podcasts.
Oh, yeah.
But it's an unusual phenomena that's happened with streaming television, obviously streaming podcasts, like the whole thing. So, but binge listeners are a unique animal. They have a whole different way of consuming and buying. Mm-hmm. What are you finding? Do you think about that when you're planning a show?
It's interesting you say that, Tracy. I thought last year I launched my first original series in partnership with an awesome TV writer. It was a fiction series where we got actors to voice things. And I'm like, I really wanted to test out this binge theory. Like, what kind of podcasts are people binging on our network? I found that if there is a particular like explosion of high profile guests on a certain show or a certain trending topic, I've seen the binge, like it's like all of a sudden there's a spike. I'm like, where is this traffic source from? I go back into data. I'm like, where's it coming from? Is it a social media share? But it typically is that topic is trending, that person's in the news, something like that. But when it came to this particular original series, I did notice a binge on a particular holiday. So that series was called Fear a Love Story. It was, again, a story within a story about, we called it fake true crime because it's not really a crime, right? It's a fake one. But I noticed on Halloween, it just got binged ridiculously, like 80,000 downloads in the day. I'm like, what the hell happened? But again, because it's a scary show, because it was Halloween, fit the profile. So that is what I've noticed and I've observed, because typically with the business podcast we produce, I haven't seen binging to be one of the characteristics of our audience. I've only really seen it in like the fiction or the true crime, or if there's a current news event that's happening in the world. That's what I've observed. But for our kind of entrepreneurial podcast, I haven't noticed a binge.
That's interesting.
I'm not aware. Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes we see, and that's what I wonder if it's probably a percentage of the listens that you see on every weekly. So you'll see in the first couple of days, you see your subscriber downloads, right? So you see all, so if you normally have 1,000 subscribers, you're going to see 1,000 downloads within the first 3 days of the show.
Yeah.
It'll just naturally happen. But then when we see a boost of like 100 downloads across many, many episodes, that's when we know we've got someone binging who found the show and are binging on a bunch of episodes.
Right.
Like we can see that happen. So it's just watching the pattern of listener, breadth. I'm going to say that because it's across instead of within a single episode. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting. The first time someone told me they were binge listening on one of my shows, I was shocked at that. Like I was like, really? You do that? And then I thought about it. It's a really, for business podcasters, when somebody wants to educate themselves deeply on something and you are a good source for it, it's a sign that you are doing your job.
100%. I also find it's podcasts that I've noticed, if they are being binged upon, it's a certain niche that they have. Like people want to deep dive into that niche. It could be like patent law or real estate law. It's like, I want to learn all there is about real estate law. This is my audio book for the day, or my audio guide for the day. So no, I hear you on that. And it's interesting because when I do the deep dives, I'm like, okay, this is interesting. I'm yet to see a binge on my ones, but it's interesting. I'm going to keep a lookout for that, Tracy.
We'll have to see that. Well, tell us a little bit about some of the shows in your media, in your client base and media group that you're proud of. Like they've really done some great accomplishment.
Sure. There's a whole heap that we're proud of all of them. I think just doing a podcast, having the courage to be like, yo, I'm going to start this. I'm going to do this for my brand. I think is phenomenal. There's a ton I'm proud of. The Future Car podcast that we do with Siemens, I think it's a brilliant podcast in educating people on the future of transportation, of mobility, like what's going to happen with flying cars or drones or electrified vehicles. Can get a bit geeky, but we all love that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I did like that one, but I'm kind of a tech geek, so.
Right. That one's great. Entrepreneurista is one of my favorite. I think the two leaders, Courtney and Steph, are such leaders with heart, and I think the guests that they have are completely inspirational. Startups in Stilettos is another one under their network. Active Ingredient, Messy and Magnificent. I could go on and on. Ageless, the Fahrenheit podcast. The Truth Prescription was active for 5 years. Now it's kind of moving into a new phase. All these podcasts, they're just great. I've learned a lot from them. I love learning from Messy and Magnificent how to be with the mess and also be thriving at the same time, the polarity. Fahrenheit, Farron Weiner is one of the most phenomenal entrepreneurs I've ever met. She's a total badass, but learning from her and her mind and the creativity that she has, I could just go on and on, but like these podcasts for me, like they inspire me. I learn so much from them, and I love producing for them too.
Well, what I was really impressed out of, you have we hear that there's not enough women in podcasting, but you have a power set of women podcasters on your network. And I love that. They are really mixing it up in diverse areas and kicking butt and taking names there.
Yeah, absolutely. Even another one I'd been, Mama Stay,
that one I loved.
It's amazing, like powerhouse women. And I think, it goes to your point. Like I read there's like it was 30% of women were taking up the podcasting market a couple of years ago, and now it's gone up probably like 5 or 10%. It's still not enough, I
But
think.
listenership has tipped over, and we now have it equalized. We now have about 50% listeners that are women. So it's got to improve, right?
Exactly. So, and that's great. But women in podcasting in particular, I think, there are groups out there, Ossa Collective's one, they just cater to women in podcasting in particular. But I think what women thrive in, and this has been the history of time, is community, right? We are well supported in community when we bond together, when we help each other out. And I think we're going to see the effects of that in podcasting too. Like, women are going to be supporting other shows, are going to be in that community building. And my shows have done that too. And I think, it's just a testament to the leader of that show, how they build their audience and their community.
I love that. Well, let's go back to the beginning so we can give some advice for those still on the fence about podcasting, haven't gotten off of that. You started the Ginni Show 2017, way back when. And what made you decide that podcasting was right for you? Because sometimes people need to hear that in order to decide if it's right for them.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Tracy. So I became a podcaster as a consequence of being on radio. That was really the first step, because the podcasts that were out in the world where my voice was on, it was just a repurposed interview that I did on FM radio. So those were coming out. And obviously, when you're on a radio network or a TV network or any kind of commercial or community network, there's guidelines you have to follow. You can't say certain things. You can talk about these things. You can't talk about these things. And I'm like, I loved my time on radio. It really helped me grow into who I was, who I am. And I think the next step for me was, okay, I've got a platform, I've got a following. Now, how can I kind of just be more me? And then slightly egotistical, so I called the show the Ginni Show. But really, you can omit the name. Like, it's more about the guest and what you can learn from it and what I could learn from it. So I thought, I just want to start this. And podcasting outside of that space where people were, tech geeks, FM broadcasters, that sort of thing, outside of that space in Australia, it wasn't as popular. So I'm like, I'm going to start something here. So I started it, and I'm like, oh, I see. My radio background kicked in, like booking guests, that sort of stuff. I had an audio producer helping me out. I just found it so rewarding in the sense of it helped me connect with people, build my network further, but it was a different level than it was on radio. Like, because this was me, this is my brand, this is my show. And I was just so proud of what I'd created. I'm like, oh, this is great. I get to have cool conversations about whatever I want. And for me, it was a learning vehicle. It was started off like a storytelling episode, like how I grew up in Australia as an immigrant girl. And this is what I learned. And these were my experiences. And, I was very blessed because that's what led me to build Ginni Media, because it got nominated for a few awards. I got some clients out of it, and then moved over to New York, as you do.
That's right. It just kind of cascaded in everything. Well, we talked earlier that it's now on a slight hiatus there because, well, you're a little busy building PodPops. And so that's taking up a lot of time.
Yeah.
But you're going to shift it. What are some thoughts about the shift? What are, now that, it's been 6 years since you started it, I'm sure. So 6 years in, you might approach it differently. What are you going to do different?
Yeah. For me, I'm going to say the word, for the first 3 years, it was about experimentation. Like, what is actually happening in the podcasting world? And I went from a weekly show to like twice a week to a daily show to I need a break to I'm going to go weekly again. And it was just interesting for me because I was just trying different things. And then I thought, okay, my word, and my mother passed in 2021, so it really made me go internal and be like, okay, what do I want to do with this podcast, right? You got to get intentional about it. Going back to what I do with my clients, I'm like, okay, what's my intention? I'm like, I just want this to be intentional. So if I can only do a season, whether it be just 8 episodes, that's how I'm going to do. And I think, and I say to my clients too, weekly is what I recommend. But if you're a seasonal kind of gal or a seasonal kind of guy or a gender non-conforming person, whatever it might be, do it that way, because that way, at least you can give your audience the quality that you want to represent. So
it's better than not sharing your voice, right?
100%. And I think for me, because I think the high achiever in me is like, you should do weekly because you say you do. And I'm like, well, I run 50 shows on top of my own too. So give yourself some grace there, girl. Like, if you do just quality episodes and then you chill for a bit, that's okay too. So I think it's taken a lot of self-soothing for me, but intentionality, value, experience is where I'm looking at it from, Tracy. So that's why I'm taking it into more of a how can I make this episode like a great experience of escapism for someone?
Well, especially because you're talking travel on the show. So you've got this like travel diary style. And I mean, I hope you keep somewhat of that going forward.
Yeah.
But even still, that in and of itself is escapism, right? So
yeah. Well, it's kind of like the way I saw it was, back in like the early 2000s when people would come back from travel and they'd have like a whole PowerPoint presentation to show you. And you're like, oh God, I'm going to be stuck here for 3 hours looking at this.
Way back when we have a
USB ports.
USB. Yeah. You're like, oh, here's this whole slideshow.
And they're like, oh gosh.
At least it's better than when we used to have actual slides.
Exactly. The projector, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that will continue. But what I really enjoyed about the travel diary experience was that, people that you don't normally hear about their travels, like you see their photos on Instagram, and you might see a caption about what happened. But I really wanted to know, how do you, Cynthia Rowley, you're a famous designer, how do you travel? She's like, oh yeah, I go swimming with sharks with my kids. I'm like, what? So things like that, you don't typically hear these experiences or hear these stories, but that's what I wanted to bring to life, that immersive audio experience. And like, how do these people travel? Why did they travel? Because if you look at the reasons why, if you read the data, why people travel, it's to escape something, heartbreak, terrible job, they want to break. It's to go and be somewhere for a purpose, a reason, or like they just want to take a break, right? But there are some trips that you go on that changes your life, and that's the part that I want to hear about and how they were changed when they got back. So yeah,
I've got the perfect guest for you. I'm going to share that after the show.
Please send her over.
Yeah, so that's what I love when somebody really can dive into their show and describe it the way you just did. Is that the ideas of who I can connect you with? That makes it easy, right?
Exactly.
And so that's the beautiful connection points that happen with podcasting. Well, Ginni, I am so glad you are just helping so many people launch into the podcasting world. What do you think the biggest challenge is right now for those that are still sitting on the fence, and what advice do you have for them?
Challenges. I think the challenges would be like what you mentioned before, Tracy, you touched on this, all of the misinformation out there. And there's obviously certain hosting platforms that do one thing, but other hosting platforms don't do another. Some do video and audio, some don't. I would say the challenge is navigating through that and actually finding a source that you trust and actually getting guidance from them. I feel podcasting, and I can speak for my clients and for myself, I wouldn't have a podcast if I didn't have the right support. So I think going through that process, like finding the right team, the right people, the right person that you need to launch your show, that that you can trust, right? You're not going to be thrown any kind of, tricks that are unrealistic or like things out of integrity. Finding that person that you can trust, because what little do you know that just that one move, I found someone that I can trust, that I can, really build an authentic connection with. That is like a stepping stone for building that connection with your audience too. So you want to make sure that you're going to a guide and a source that you can trust, that's authentic, and is going to guide you in the right way and support you in the right way. I think that's the biggest challenge coming up with all this information coming out.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I feel like that's the theme of the week because I just interviewed someone who came out of being a park ranger, and he is a guide by like it's his core of who he is, and now he's a podcast guide. And he was saying the same thing, that guide is so essential, and it doesn't have to be an expensive guide, right? Like you may make that choice later, but it doesn't have to be that way. But thinking that it's so easy, because there are a lot of people out there selling you that it is so easy, just pop on your iPhone and you'll be fine. It's not going to actually get you going. There's too many missing pieces, and they're counting on that because they have something to sell you on the other side.
100%. And also, like I just gave a talk yesterday, and I said, anyone looking to be a guest on a podcast, buy a microphone. Like, give that respect to your host, please. And also to your audience and your potential clients in that audience. You want to be represented in the best light, right? And you're like, but that's expensive. And I'm like, well,
$80.
It's an investment, like anything is. So and it's also for yourself too. Like, you want to represent yourself in the best way. So yeah, I think finding the right guide.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is my favorite part about it. When I Zoom with people, they're always going, wow, you sound great. I was like, I think that's my job. I better sound great, but it's really this $80 microphone, and you can do this too. It's not difficult. I agree with you that it's so not difficult, but I love that you are this wonderful guide that is going to help people figure out their path, especially in that early strategy stage. It's so critical. It keeps people podcasting. And that's why you have such a successful media network.
Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate that. It's really, really lovely to have a conversation with you about all this stuff as well. It's like therapy. Podcast therapy. There's another business idea. Pod therapy. There we go.
Pod therapy. I love it. Yeah. Well, we may have to collaborate on that one. I love
we
that.
might have to, yeah.
Well, Ginni, thank you for joining me. And I will be sure to make sure everybody knows how to find you when I talk about you in my after comments from our interview.
Amazing. Thank you, Tracy, for your time. I've had a lot of fun.
Guidance is becoming the theme of the week. I mentioned that as Ginni was saying it, but we don't have enough great guiding voices that are not a part of this digital marketing space that has become podcasting, where they're selling you courses. They've been there, done it once. There are not enough people like Ginni who bring power and proof to what they're guiding you on, and do it from this, as she put it, authentic place, this true heart for and love of podcasting. So what she brings to the table is inarguably at a much higher end than we do at our company at Podetize, but it is so valuable and so critically important to the kind of clients. You don't help a company like Siemens get what they're going for without having true strategy and understanding and diving in deep to getting to know what their outcomes are, and then helping them structure and craft that is why it can stick around, why they want to do another show and another show. And she has many clients who are serial podcasters for a reason, because she's provided them this safe place that makes it easy to produce what you need to produce, and showing them that there's a great return on investment for them in their time, energy, money spent. That's real power. So you're going to want to go check out Ginni Media, which means you're going to want to go to the blog post for this episode at thebingefactor.com, catch up, check out all these great shows. And there's just such a laundry list of them. You can click on it on their website and be able to see Entrepreneurista. I think that's how you say it. Mama Stay. Oh my gosh, what a great show. Startups and Stilettos, one of my favorites so far. Becoming Your Best, Uncover Your Magic. All the Siemens shows are fantastic. She was mentioning the one about travel, all of those things. And of course, don't forget to check the Ginni Show and PodPops. Definitely subscribe to PodPops. So there's so many shows out there. So check out Ginni Media and really dive in and hear what a highly produced show sounds like. Maybe that's for you. So thanks everyone for listening. I'm Tracy Hazzard here on The Binge Factor, and I am so grateful that you want to come along with me as I expand my knowledge of all the different kinds of people, all the different kinds of shows, and all the different types of successful hosts we have here in the podcasting industry.
You've been listening to the Binge Factor podcast. For more information on podcasting and videocasting success tips and tactics, please go to thebingefactor.com. And be sure to listen to our other show for podcasters called Feed Your Brand. If you'd like to be interviewed on this show, as well as featured in Tracy's column, please go to thebingefactor.com/guest and apply.